We're winding down our Black History Month conversations with Dr. Newell Bringhurst. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Walker Lewis, a faithful black elder in Boston, Massachusetts. In fact, Wilford Woodruff once described this faithful black elder as an example to our more whiter brethren. Check out our conversation. I also want to remind you that our Black History Month sale is ending, so all of our books are on sale. Paul Reeve, Russell Stevenson, and Darren Smith, Dr. Darren Smith, how did I forget that one? Those are going to go off of sale, so they're right now 25 to 30% off. So please check that out this week. The sale will end on the 28th, so make sure you get those orders in right away. Now back to our conversation. Well, let me ask you a question, because I know Paul's disputed a few other things that I wanted to get your opinion on. So as I understand it, I talked with Mark Staker a few months ago, and one of the things he said that typically, and I don't know how long this lasted, but typically, especially in the 1830s, I'm not so sure about the 1840s, but in the 1830s, typically in the when a male was baptized, he was often ordained immediately to the priesthood. And so, as I recall, I want to say that Warner McCary specifically, I believe he was baptized in 1846, if my memory is correct. Now, the question is, was he ordained to the priesthood? And I think there's a difference of opinion. I think Connell O'Donovan has said we don't have a smoking gun to say that we can answer this, but I believe Connell O'Donovan believes that he has. Paul kind of questions that, and I believe it was Orson Hyde that actually married.
Married him and ordained him. That's the claim that's made, and the evidence is really very thin on that point. And I've always, because Orson Hyde had a reputation of being kind of anti-black. I mean, in that those statements he's making about blacks, the only reason that it could be that he ordained, baptized, ordained, and supposedly married. I mean, Angela Pulley Hudson suggests that they were even sealed, that they were sealed through a temple ceremony. I mean, she even goes so far as to suggest, and I think the evidence for that is a little bit shaky, but you could almost make a case. I think she tries to make a case that there was another Indian, she seems to suggest that Orson Hyde thought he was Indian rather than black, and that would have been easier because Indians were being ordained and were being baptized and weren't suffering the discrimination that blacks were, so it could be that there had been another Indian Mormon by the name of Dana, who had received the priesthood and was considered a prominent early Mormon Indian. I'm trying to think of his first name. Last name was Dana, as I recall.
Yeah, I don't remember.
And so he could have seen it as a parallel situation, that he really was sold on the fact of McCary actually being an Indian.
Okay, so you're saying it's kind of open to interpretation?
Yeah, it's open to interpretation, and I don't think the proof is really concrete, because we don't have any record of ordination, not even a record of them being sealed or married in the temple. And this supposedly took place in Nauvoo in 46, just as they were leaving, as they were abandoning Nauvoo. And the precise date is a little bit hard to establish. And so I've always wondered about that. One of the earliest places where that's cited is in James J. Strang's newspaper, where they mention or something about, almost in a parenthetical way, that McCary and Lucy had been married by Orson Hyde, and and obviously the Strangite would be hostile toward Hyde. And, so is that the most reliable source? A newspaper published by Strang in Voorhees, Wisconsin, where are they getting the information from? And so, and it's a hostile source, because the Strangites probably they're going to do what they want to try to discredit, whatever the Utah or whatever the Brighamites are doing.
Well, and I want to ask you another disputed issue. So And it involves Warner McCary as well in Cincinnati. So after he left in 1846, they traveled to Cincinnati. I understand that Elijah Abel was serving a mission in Cincinnati.
Yeah, he was there in Cincinnati, and there's some suggestion that they had some interaction, and there's even suggested that Elijah Abel flirted with the Strangite movement. There's been suggestions of that way too, and I haven't seen concrete proof on that, but it's whether it was a means of trying to slander him or if he really did, that's a little bit unclear, and I've questioned that assumption because he was such a faithful early member of the church. I have a hard time believing that he would abandon, maybe he felt that Strang was a greater source of authority, and and maybe initially sold on his arguments because Strang, unlike Brigham Young initially, made reference to the fact that he was the prophetic successor to Joseph Smith, and that would have been easy maybe for him to believe, and maybe he did have a brief flirtation, so you can't completely discount it.
Yeah, I know Connell O'Donovan, as I've done some research on this, Connell thinks that Elijah may have joined with Strang for a very short time.
Yeah.
Russell Stevenson, on the other hand, argues, well, if he had done that, then there would have been a good reason to bar Elijah from the priesthood. But Elijah continued to keep his priesthood even back to this 1879 meeting that I think you referred to.
Yeah, he's still in the church, and he went on a third mission. He actually served 3 different missions for the church. The one up in Canada initially, and in the 1830s. Then he serves at a second mission down in Cincinnati, and then he serves a third mission again going to Canada, and that's when he gets sick and comes home early and dies.
So you don't have an opinion one way or the other on whether Elijah?
I would tend to discount it, but unless it just doesn't seem like in the pattern of his behavior. Although there is the possibility that maybe he was, initially for a short period of time convinced of the prophetic authority of Strang, and then maybe began to think otherwise for whatever reasons. I mean, I'm not discounting the possibility, but I remain, of two minds on that, and I guess an agnostic on that issue.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about another important black person in history, and both Walker Lewis and his son Enoch Lewis. We kind of alluded a little bit to that before. Tell us a little bit about Walker Lewis. What was his background and that sort of thing?
Well, he was based in Massachusetts, in Lowell, Massachusetts, and he was a barber, and supposedly he was also a Mason. He was also belonged to a black Masonic lodge, so there was kind of an interesting Masonic connection there with him, and he, Connell O'Donovan's done a lot more research on him than I have, and shown that he was he had interaction with a number of the apostles, that were coming through and all that. So he well known amongst the apostles of the church, and it was William Smith, the younger brother of Joseph Smith, that ordained him an elder. And so it's William Appleby who expresses shock when he comes upon him and he finds out that Walker Lewis is an elder in the church, and it may and this is after the death of Joseph Smith. And writes back, is it right that this man should hold the priesthood? If it's so, I have yet to learn it. And so that's caused some people to say, well, the ban was maybe in place even earlier, but there isn't other evidence to support that, whether maybe it was just because whatever was going through Walker Lewis's mind, there just weren't that many blacks in the church, and so maybe this was kind of an unusual situation for him. So ultimately, as I say, he becomes kind of a well-known figure to member, and they don't seem to question his priesthood, and so that kind of supports the argument that, one more indication that there was no ban on black ordination. And even in later, even later church leaders, all the way down into the 20th century, when Benyon is doing his study, in 54, church leaders acknowledged that Walker Lewis had been ordained, and that was acknowledged by even J. Reuben Clark. I discussed this in an article that's going to be forthcoming. The 54 recollections and the church struggling with whether blacks could be ordained in that, and what the historical justification were. But getting back to Walker Lewis himself, he eventually makes his way out to Utah, thinking that he could maybe get his endowments, but they deny him, and so he makes his way back to Boston or to Lowell and resumes his barber practice. I mean, there's suggestions that later on Jane James wants to be sealed to Walker Lewis because she's aware of who Walker Lewis was and that he was indeed a priesthood holder, and to bolster her request, the legitimacy of her request for endowment, she says, "Can I be sealed to Walker Lewis?" And of course, that's denied. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a poignant story in and of itself. And a person you might want to interview concerning that would be Margaret Blair Young.
I actually have interviewed her.
Oh, so you know all of,
Yeah.
She knows a lot more about Jane James than I do, because she did so much research in putting together that play. But anyway, so Walker Lewis ends up, becoming disaffected from the church because, he doesn't receive his endowments, and he doesn't receive the respect he feels like he deserves from Brigham Young, because by this time, black priesthood denial is firmly in place.
Well, and I believe he was actually in Utah during the time when Brigham Young made this big speech in the legislature.
Yeah, I think that, that's right. That's what Connell O'Donovan, and this is a shock to him, that he sees, how negative Brigham Young is relative to the status and the situation of black people, that I'm very, he's feeling, gosh, how could I belong to a church where the prophet, seer, and revelator is making these extreme anti-black theological statements.
Well, and I think what's really ironic about this whole situation is, as we kind of, it's amazing to me how many of these people in the early days interacted with each other, because in, I want to say 1846, it was Warner McCary that went to Brigham Young in this special meeting and said, "Why am I cursed?" And Brigham Young said, "You're not cursed. We have a great elder in Lowell."
Yeah, right.
Walker
I mean,
Lewis.
that's the irony. Yeah, that's the irony, because Brigham Young is acknowledging the legitimacy of by saying that he's acknowledging the legitimacy of Walker Lewis's ordination, and so that's one more proof that he hasn't come to the cusp of denying blacks the priesthood. And as I say, I think that I think, as Paul Reeve has convincingly argued, it's tied up with the legalization of slavery in Utah. It becomes very much tied. That's the final coup de grace. There's these other things in the background, but by the time they get to Utah and they decide to legalize slavery, that is the final. That's the thing that really pulls it all together.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Newell Bringhurst. That ends our discussions about Black History Month. However, we're not done with Newell just yet. In our next conversation, we'll talk about his work on biographer Fawn Brodie. I'll have him introduce our next episode here.
Brodie really was a path-breaking study in trying to attribute reasons or motives to Joseph Smith and his practice of polygamy. And it was controversial because she starts it out by her major premise is that Joseph Smith was a conscious fraud. And when you make that statement at the beginning of the book, that's immediately going to send up red flags all over the place. But when you get into the book itself, she actually is quite empathetic.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.